Hey there! Tonight we're entering a myth that doesn't begin with battle or betrayal, but with something far more unsettling: absence. This is a story about what happens when something essential is quietly removed from the world, and how everything that depended on it begins to drift without quite knowing why. It's a tale told in silences, in boundaries slowly dissolving, and in the strange ache left behind when order forgets its own shape. If these long, drifting stories help you unwind or feel a little less alone, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a calm comment, perhaps just where you're listening from, or what time the night has reached for you. Only if it feels peaceful. Now let your breathing slow, let the edges of the day soften, as we step into an ancient world where a god was erased, and the quiet consequences of that choice began to ripple through everything that remained. In the shadowed recesses of eternity, where the winds of creation still whispered secrets to the void, a silence fell upon Olympus. It was not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows the removal of something essential, a quiet so precise that even the stars seemed to hesitate, unsure how to continue without it. A god was gone, not slain, not imprisoned, but erased. His existence lifted cleanly from the structure of the world by the deliberate hands of his own kin. No thunder announced the act. No sky split in warning. Only the faint, almost imperceptible shift of balance. Like a boundary giving way, unnoticed until everything depending on it began to drift. The council of gods had gathered under the golden dome of the great hall, where light from the eternal flame cast long shadows across their immortal faces. Zeus, the thunderer, sat at the head, his eyes like storm clouds gathering force. Beside him, Hera, her gaze sharp as the edge of a blade, nodded in silent accord. Poseidon, with the sea's restless energy coiling in his veins, clenched his trident until the metal groaned. Athena, wisdom incarnate, lowered her head, her owl perched silently on her shoulder, its eyes unblinking. Apollo, the light bringer, strummed a single note on his lyre that hung in the air, unresolved. And Hermes, the swift messenger, hovered at the edges, his wings folded, his usual mirth replaced by a quiet unease. They spoke in murmurs, voices that had commanded empires now reduced to whispers, as if the walls themselves might betray them. The god in question, let us call him Erebos, though that name too was soon to be forbidden, had held a role so fundamental that it wove through the fabric of existence, like thread in a tapestry. He was the guardian of thresholds, the keeper of boundaries between realms, the line where light met shadow, where life brushed against death, where mortal dreams touched divine will. Without fanfare, he maintained the delicate equilibrium that allowed Olympus to stand eternal, the mortal world to spin in ordered cycles, and the underworld to hold its restless souls in check. But rebellion had stirred in Erebos' heart, not a loud uprising, but a quiet questioning. He had begun to challenge the decrees, to suggest that the gods' iron grip on fate might loosen, allowing mortals more agency in their destinies. Why must we bind them so tightly? He had asked in one fateful assembly, his voice calm as a still pond. Their struggles forge meaning. Our order stifles it. The others saw threat in his words, a spark that could ignite chaos. Zeus, fearing the erosion of authority, decreed the erasure. The vote was swift, the ritual precise. With a wave of his hand, the thunderer unbound Erebos from the divine ledger. His temple on the slopes faded like mist in the morning sun. His altars crumbled to dust. Worshippers awoke with empty memories, their prayers redirecting to other gods without knowing why. Erebos himself vanished, not destroyed, but unmade, his essence scattered into the ether, nameless and formless. At first, the heavens sighed in relief. The council dispersed, each god returning to their domains with a sense of restored harmony. Zeus hurled bolts across the sky, affirming his dominion. Hera tended her gardens, the peacocks strutting as if nothing had changed. Poseidon stirred the oceans, waves crashing in rhythmic obedience. The world below continued its turn. Farmers sowed seeds. Warriors clashed in fields. Lovers whispered under starlit skies. But beneath the surface, the imbalance began its slow creep, like roots burrowing into soil, unseen until they split the earth apart. In the mortal realm, the first signs were subtle, dismissed as quirks of nature. A shepherd on the hills of Arcadia watched as his flock wandered aimlessly, no longer heeding the invisible lines that once separated pasture from cliff. The animals, drawn by some inexplicable pull, stepped over edges they had always avoided, tumbling into ravines. The shepherd scratched his head, muttering about ill omens, but life pressed on. In the city of Athens, a philosopher paced the agora, his thoughts fracturing mid-sentence. Ideas that once flowed with clarity now blurred at the edges, as if the boundary between logic and madness had thinned. He shook it off, blaming age. But his students noticed the hesitation, the unfinished scrolls piling up. Deeper still, in the underworld, Hades felt the shift. The river Styx, that eternal barrier between life and death, but began to meander from its course. Souls lingered on its banks longer than they should, whispering of unfinished business, their forms flickering like flames in a draught. Charon, the ferryman, poled his boat with growing frustration as the currents pulled unpredictably, carrying him off-rote. Something's amiss. He grumbled to no one, his voice echoing across the dark waters. Hades, seated on his throne of obsidian, drummed his fingers, sensing the strain on the veils he guarded. The dead were restless, their moans rising in pitch, as if the walls holding them back grew porous. On Olympus, the gods remained oblivious at first, their immortality blinding them to the slow decay. Apollo's prophecies, once sharp as arrows, began to waver. He gazed into his sacred pool, but the images rippled without cause, futures blending into pasts in confusing mosaics. A fleeting distortion. He assured himself, tuning his lyre to drown the doubt. Athena's strategies for mortal wars faltered. Armies she favoured crossed lines they shouldn't, leading to unexpected defeats. She pondered the anomalies in her temple, her brow furrowed, but attributed them to human folly. Yet the tension built, a quiet pressure like the earth before a quake. In a remote village, a child was born with eyes that saw beyond the veil glimpses of gods walking unseen among men. Boundaries dissolved. The villagers whispered of curses, sacrificing to appease unknown deities, their rituals hollow without Erebos' guiding hand. In the seas, Poseidon's domain, whirlpools formed where none had been, sucking ships into depths without warning, as the line between surface and abyss blurred. But fishermen hauled nets filled with creatures from forbidden depths, monstrous forms that writhed and screamed in alien tongues. As days stretched into weeks, the imbalance spread like ink in water. Dreams invaded waking hours. Mortals awoke with memories not their own, echoes of divine thoughts seeping through cracked barriers. Warriors in battle hesitated, seeing shadows of fallen comrades rise, as if death's door swung loosely. Lovers quarrelled over illusions, jealousies born from blurred lines between fidelity and fantasy. The gods, in their lofty halls, began to feel the chill. Hermes, delivering messages, found paths twisting unexpectedly, arriving late or in wrong realms. The ways are changing, he reported to Zeus, his voice laced with unease. Zeus dismissed it at first, thunder rumbling in denial. But in the quiet of night, as he gazed over the world from his throne, he noticed the stars, once fixed in their courses, shifting ever so slightly, as if the celestial boundaries wavered. A single constellation dimmed, its light diffusing into the void. The thunderer gripped his bolt tighter, a flicker of doubt crossing his eternal features. The erasure, meant to preserve order, had instead sown the seeds of its undoing. And as the world turned beneath him, the crack widened, promising a fracture that no divine will could mend. The wind on Olympus carried a new note, a low hum of inevitability, urging the listener onward into the deepening shadow. The first true fracture appeared not in thunder or flame, but in the quiet rhythm of dawn. Across the eastern horizon, where Apollo had always driven his chariot in unbroken arc, the light hesitated, not a dramatic faltering, no darkening of the sky, no sudden eclipse, but a delay so slight that only the oldest shepherds noticed. The sun rose later by the breadth of a single breath. Birds, attuned to the precise moment of first light, remained perched on branches longer than custom demanded, their songs starting half a measure late. Farmers paused at their ploughs, glancing eastward, uncertain why the familiar warmth arrived with a faint reluctance, as though reluctant to cross an invisible line that no longer held firm. In the orchards of Peloponnesus, the boundary between ripeness and rot began to blur. Fruit that should have clung to the branch another day fell at the first touch of morning dew, but splitting open to reveal flesh already softening toward decay. Olive trees, ancient sentinels of the land, dropped their harvest prematurely. The oil pressed from those early olives carried a faint bitterness no mortal tongue had tasted before. The villagers gathered the fallen crop in silence, pressing the fruit anyway, because to waste was to invite greater misfortune. When they poured libations at the altars of Demeter, the wine they offered seemed to evaporate before it touched the ground, as though the earth itself had grown too porous to receive the gift. On the slopes of Mount Helicon, the Muses felt the disturbance most keenly. Their sacred spring, once clear as crystal and inexhaustible, began to run slower. Poets who came to drink and receive inspiration found the water thinner, the visions it granted fragmented. Lines of verse that once flowed like rivers now broke apart mid-thought. One bard, renowned for his epics, sat beside the spring for 3 days and nights without drinking, waiting for the familiar current of words. When it finally came, the tale he sang was of a god whose name he could not recall, whose absence left a hollow shape in every verse. The listeners shivered. Though the sun stood high, they clapped politely, then hurried away, unwilling to carry the unfinished sorrow home. Far below, in the shadowed chambers of the underworld, the imbalance deepened. The asphodel fields, once a monotonous but stable grey, began to show patches of unnatural colour, flecks of crimson where none should grow, streaks of gold that mimicked the light of the living world. Souls who had long accepted their colourless eternity now lifted their heads, drawn toward those impossible hues. Some stepped out of line, wandering toward the forbidden borders. The guardians of the gates, 3, headed Cerberus among them, snarled and snapped, but their authority seemed diluted, as though the very concept of boundary had lost its edge. One shade, a woman who had died in childbirth centuries earlier, reached the river's edge and simply kept walking. The waters of Lith, meant to wash memory away, lapped at her ankles without effect. She crossed, trailing fragments of a life she was never supposed to remember. Hades watched from his high obsidian seat. He did not rise in anger. He merely observed, fingers steepled, the faintest crease forming between his brows. Persephone, seated at his side, reached out and laid her hand over his. Neither spoke. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of centuries of shared silence. They had ruled the realm of endings. Now they presided over something new, the slow dissolution of endings themselves. Above, on Olympus, the gods began to notice the small refusals of the world. Artemis drew her bow at twilight and found the string looser than memory insisted it should be. The arrow flew true, yet when it struck the stag she had marked, the creature did not fall cleanly. It staggered, turned, and looked directly at her, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition. Then it vanished into the underbrush, leaving only a trail of blood that dried too quickly, as though time itself hurried to erase the evidence. Artemis lowered her weapon, staring after the vanished beast. For the first time in her endless life, the hunt felt incomplete. Ares, god of war, strode across fields where battles still raged. He had always delighted in chaos, yet now the chaos refused to obey familiar patterns. Swords that should have shattered on impact held together one strike too long. Shields splintered at the wrong angle. Wounds that should have been mortal closed without reason. Warriors who had fought under his banner for glory now fought with a strange reluctance, as though the line between courage and madness had grown too thin to distinguish. Ares roared commands that no longer carried the same force. His voice reached the soldiers, but something in them hesitated before obeying. He returned to Olympus, armour still bright with blood that was not entirely mortal, and for once said nothing. In the great hall, the council convened again, not summoned by decree, but drawn by unspoken agreement. They stood in their accustomed places, yet the air between them felt stretched, fragile. Zeus spoke first, his voice low, almost conversational. The world turned strangely. No one contradicted him. Even Hermes, ever quick with a jest, remained silent, wings folded tight against his back. Poseidon broke the quiet. My tides rise when they should ebb. The moon pulls, yet the sea resists. I have drowned fleets in punishment and watched them rise again the next dawn, unchanged. Athena turned her owl toward the centre of the circle. Mortals question more than they once did. Their philosophers speak of freedom without knowing why the word now burns in their throats. My strategies unravel the moment they are set in motion. Apollo strummed a chord that should have resolved into harmony. Instead it lingered, dissonant, refusing to conclude. The oracles are silent, not empty, silent, as though prophecy itself has forgotten how to speak. Hera watched them all, her expression unreadable. We removed a thread because we feared it might fray the whole. Now the tapestry frays without it. No one met her gaze. Outside the hall, night had fallen. The constellations wheeled above, but one faint pattern. The one mortals had once called the threshold had begun to drift. Stars that had anchored the figure of a kneeling guardian now wandered independently, their light scattering like spilled grain. The sky itself seemed to breathe differently, slower, as though remembering a rhythm it had been taught to forget. Zeus rose, the sound of his throne scraping marble echoed longer than it should have. "We will watch," he said. "We will wait. Order will reassert itself." The others inclined their heads, though none believed the words carried the certainty they once had. As they dispersed, each to their private halls, the mountain itself seemed to exhale, a long, slow breath that carried the scent of pine and iron and something older, something that had waited beneath stone since the first dawn. And somewhere, in the spaces between realms, a name no longer spoken began to echo again, not as sound, but as pressured. The shape of a god pressing back against the place where he had been erased. The stars shifted another fraction of an inch. The listener felt it too. The quiet pull of something returning, patient, inevitable, and still unnamed. The third month after the erasure brought a stillness that was not peace. Rivers slowed, not enough to alarm the fishermen who cast their lines at dawn, but enough that the current no longer tugged the bobber downstream with its old insistence. Water lingered in bends and shallows where it once hurried past. Reeds grew thicker along the banks, their roots drinking deeper, as though the earth itself were trying to hold the flow in place. In the village of Tempe, children skipped stones across the Peneus and watched them settle on the surface longer than memory allowed. 3, 4, 5 heartbeats before the water finally claimed them. The elders, sitting in the shade of plane trees, remarked that the river had grown thoughtful. They did not say afraid. In the high pastures of Thessaly, the herds moved differently. Goats that had always followed invisible trails between grazing grounds now paused at every ridge, sniffing the air as though testing for a scent no longer there. Rams stood motionless for hours, staring toward the horizon where Olympus rose pale against the sky. Shepherds whistled, clapped, threw stones to startle them forward. The animals obeyed, but slowly, as if each step required a separate permission they no longer trusted to receive. One old ewe, white as new marble, refused to cross a narrow footbridge She had traversed every season of her life. She planted her hooves, eyes fixed on the far bank, and would not be moved until the shepherd carried her across in his arms. When he set her down, she did not graze. She simply stood, facing the direction from which they had come. The imbalance had begun to speak through bodies now. In the sanctuaries, the oracles grew quiet in new ways. At Delphi, the Pythia no longer convulsed. She sat upright on the tripod, eyes open, breathing slow and even. When the priests asked for prophecy, she answered in single words: threshold, absence, return, each syllable falling like a pebble into deep water. The priests wrote them down, puzzled, then burned the scrolls. Certain the fumes had confused her tongue. Yet the words lingered in their mouths like ash. They tasted of something older than smoke. At Dodona, the sacred oaks no longer rustled in answer to questions. The leaves hung motionless even when wind moved the surrounding forest. Only after long minutes would a single branch stir, brushing another, producing a sound so faint it seemed remembered rather than heard. Pilgrims waited beneath the canopy, heads bowed until their necks ached and their knees trembled. When the sound finally came, it carried no prediction, only recognition, a low, repeated syllable that might once have been part of a name. They left without offerings, palms empty, carrying instead the weight of something heard but not understood. On Olympus, the gods moved through their days with the careful precision of those avoiding broken glass. Zeus walked the marble corridors at night, sandals silent, pausing at windows that overlooked the mortal world. He watched campfires flicker in distant valleys, listened to the wind that carried no prayers addressed to the one who had been removed. Each night he lingered longer. Each night he returned to his throne with the same question, unasked on his lips, whether the silence below was punishment or evidence. Hera tended her golden peacock, running her fingers through feathers that had begun to lose their iridescence. The bird no longer spread its tail in display. It sat quietly beside her, head lowered, as though listening for a footfall that never came. When she offered it pomegranate seeds, it accepted them without greed, without joy, merely with the courtesy of something that remembered hunger, but no longer felt it. Poseidon descended to the deepest trenches of his kingdom and stood motionless among blind creatures that had never known light. He waited there for hours, feeling the slow pulse of currents that once obeyed his slightest gesture. Now they brushed past him like strangers. He lifted his trident, struck the seafloor once. The shock travelled outward, stirring silt and waking things that had slept since the world was young. Yet the sea did not roar back in answer. It simply settled again, quieter than before. Athena sat in her library, scrolls unrolled across the table, maps pinned beneath weights of obsidian and gold. She traced battle lines that no longer held meaning. Armies she had once guided to inevitable victory now wandered fields without decisive clash, skirmishing without conclusion, retreating without defeat. She closed one scroll, opened another, closed it again. Her owl watched from its perch, unblinking. For the first time, Athena felt the sting of irrelevance, not as anger, but as a cold weight settling behind her eyes. Apollo no longer played for pleasure. He plucked single notes on his lyre, each one allowed to fade completely before the next. The music did not build toward crescendo or resolution. It simply existed, then ceased, then existed again. He played until his fingers ached, then played more slowly, as though hoping the silence between notes might speak what the notes themselves could not. Sometimes he thought he heard an answering tone, not from the strings, but from the air itself, faint, patient, waiting. Hermes, who had always darted between realms, now walked. His winged sandals remained laced, unused. He travelled the old paths on foot, feeling the ground beneath him as mortals did, solid, reluctant, slow. He delivered messages still, but they arrived later than they should have. Gods opened doors to find him already standing there, expression unreadable. When they asked why he delayed, he answered only, "The roads are longer now." In the mortal world, the strangeness became ritual. At a crossroads shrine long abandoned, the villagers began to leave small stones in patterns they could not explain. Not offerings to Hermes, not prayers to Hecate, but simply arrangements of river pebbles, each one placed with deliberate care, forming shapes that suggested doorways, windows, thresholds. No one spoke of the erased god, yet the shapes they made echoed the outlines of his vanished temples. Children who played near the shrine avoided stepping inside the patterns. When asked why, they said only that it felt like walking through someone else's memory. In a coastal town beneath the cliffs of Epirus, fishermen ceased to mend torn nets on the beach at noon. Instead, they carried them to the water's edge at twilight and let the tide take the frayed ends, as though offering the damage itself to something that might understand it. The sea accepted the threads without resistance, drawing them down into darkness. The men watched until the last filament vanished, then turned away without speaking. They did not know why they performed this act. Only that the next day the nets they cast came up whole, the tears gone as though they had never been. Night by night, the sky grew stranger. The moon, once reliable in her phases, began to linger at each quarter. Full light held for an extra hour, then 2, when she finally waned. The crescent was thinner than physics allowed, a silver thread stretched almost to breaking. Mortals gazed upward and felt. Without words, that something watched them back, not with malice, but with the patience of someone who has waited lifetimes to be remembered. On Olympus, Zeus stood alone on the highest terrace, wind tearing at his robes. He lifted his face to the sky and spoke no command, issued no decree. He simply asked, in a voice so low it might have been thought rather than sound, "Are you still there?" The wind answered with silence. But the silence was no longer empty. It had acquired shape, weight, direction, and it was listening. The listener, too, felt the change, not a shout across the heavens, but the soft click of something locking into place, far away and very close at once. The 4th month arrived without announcement, as though time itself had begun to forget the habit of seasons. In the valleys of Arcadia, frost appeared on the leaves of olive trees, long after the last cold night had passed. Not heavy frost, not killing frost, just a thin silver rim along each leaf's edge, delicate as breath on glass. Farmers rubbed the silver away with calloused thumbs, only to find it returned the next morning, identical, patient. They stopped rubbing. They began instead to walk the groves at first light, touching each tree in turn, as if greeting something that had been waiting. The trees did not answer, but they did not shed their leaves either. They held them, silver-edged, through days that grew warmer than memory insisted they should. Down in the lowlands, where the Alpheus River once carved its steady path to the sea, the water began to pool in places it had never lingered before. Small lakes formed in the bends, shallow, mirror, still, reflecting the sky with unnatural clarity. Children gathered at these new pools, dropping pebbles and watching the ripples spread without hurry, without decay. The ripples moved outward in perfect circles, then simply stopped, frozen in place like ripples cast in bronze. The children did not laugh. They watched until the water stilled again, then dropped another stone, repeating the act with the solemnity of ritual. Parents found them there at dusk, still dropping stones, still waiting for something the ripples refused to finish telling. In the city of Corinth, the marketplace grew strangely quiet at noon. Merchants who had once shouted their wares now spoke in murmurs, as though afraid to disturb an agreement. No one remembered signing. Coins changed hands without clink, but cloth passed from palm to palm without rustle. When a buyer asked the price of figs, the seller answered only with a number that felt incomplete. 7 drachmae, then silence, as though the transaction required a missing syllable to close. Buyers paid anyway. They left with figs that tasted sweeter than they should have, yet left an aftertaste of absence on the tongue. The imbalance had learned to wear the shape of longing. On Olympus, the gods no longer gathered in the great hall. They drifted instead through private colonnades and shadowed gardens, each moving alone, each carrying their own version of the same unspoken question. They avoided one another's eyes, not from anger, but from the fear that meeting another's gaze might force the question into sound. Zeus walked the western terrace at twilight, hands clasped behind his back. He had not hurled a thunderbolt in weeks. The sky remained clear, almost insultingly blue. He stopped at the marble balustrade and looked down upon the mortal world, searching for signs of rebellion, of chaos, of anything that might justify the erasure. He found only stillness, too deep, too complete. A single cloud drifted across the plain far below, casting a shadow that moved more slowly than clouds should move. Zeus watched until the shadow reached the horizon and dissolved. Then he turned away, shoulders set as though carrying something heavier than lightning. Hera sat beneath her myrtle trees, weaving a garland she would never wear. Her fingers moved with the same deliberate grace they always had, yet each knot she tied felt looser than the last. The peacocks no longer strutted. They walked in slow circles around her bench, heads lowered, tails dragging. One bird paused directly in front of her, fixed her with its jeweled eye, and uttered a single low note, not the usual cry, but something closer to a sigh. Hera reached out, laid her palm against the bird's breast. She felt no heartbeat, only a faint vibration, like distant thunder remembered by bone. Poseidon descended again to the abyssal plain and stood among the cold currents. He planted his trident in the seafloor and waited. Nothing answered. No Leviathan rose. No whirlpool spun. Only the slow drift of sediment past his ankles, patient as snowfall. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence of his own kingdom. For the first time he understood that silence was not emptiness. It was memory holding its breath. Athena remained in her chamber, surrounded by maps that no longer made sense. She had begun to draw new lines. Lines that crossed old borders. Lines that curved where straight paths once ran. Lines that ended in nothing. She studied them for hours, then erased them with the heel of her hand. The parchment remained blank. Yet the ghost of the lines lingered, faint indentations that caught the lamplight. She traced them again with her fingertip, feeling the slight resistance of paper that remembered pressure. She did not weep. She simply sat, but fingertip resting on the place where all lines converged into blankness. Apollo played no longer. He sat on the steps of his temple at dawn, lyre unstrung across his knees. He watched the sun rise, later each morning, slower each time. When the first ray touched the marble, he lifted his face to it as though asking forgiveness. The light did not warm him. It simply illuminated the lines of strain around his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. He did not speak. He waited for the sun to finish climbing, then rose and walked back inside, leaving the lyre behind on the steps like an offering no one would claim. Hermes no longer flew. He walked every path now, sandals touching earth, wings folded tight. He carried no messages. There were none left to carry. Instead he moved from village to village, unseen, unnoticed, watching. He saw mothers pause mid-lullaby, the melody breaking as though the next note had been erased. He saw old men sit beside empty hearths, staring at the place where a chair once stood, though no chair had ever been removed. He saw children draw shapes in the dust, doorways, arches, thresholds, then carefully step around them, never through. Hermes watched, said nothing, and walked on. In the mortal world, the strangeness became inheritance. A grandmother in a mountain village taught her granddaughter to set an extra place at table each evening. Not for a guest, but for someone who might one day remember to arrive. They never spoke of who it was. They simply laid the plate, poured the wine, left the bread untouched. When the girl asked why, the old woman answered only, "Because once we forgot, and forgetting has a cost." In a fishing hamlet on the coast, the elders carved small wooden keys and tied them to the prows of boats. No lock existed to fit them. No door waited on shore, yet every boat carried one, polished smooth by salt and wind. When storms came, the keys did not protect them, but the men felt steadier holding them, as though something remembered how to turn. At night, across the wide lands, fires burned lower, not because wood was scarce, but because the flames themselves seemed reluctant to rise too high, as though afraid of crossing an unmarked boundary between light and dark. On Olympus, Zeus stood once more on the western terrace. This time he did not speak aloud. He simply opened his hands, palms upward, as though offering something he no longer possessed. Far below, in the deepest hollow of a forgotten cave, a single drop of water fell from stalactite to pool. It fell more slowly than physics permitted. When it struck the surface, the ripple did not spread. It simply opened, a perfect circle of absence that widened without moving, but deepening without sound, and in that widening circle something remembered its own name. Not as word, as pressure, as the shape left when everything else has been removed. The listener felt the air change, thicker now, slower, carrying the faint scent of iron and pine and something older than both. Something that had waited long enough. The 5th month came wrapped in fog that refused to lift. It settled first over the lowlands of Boeotia, thick and pale, swallowing the bases of hills until only their peaks remained visible, floating like islands above a sea of white. And travellers on the roads paused, uncertain whether to press forward or turn back. The fog did not chill. It simply occupied space, heavy with the scent of wet stone and crushed herbs no one could name. When men lit torches, the flames burned steadily but cast no warmth beyond their immediate circle. Shadows lengthened strangely within the mist, stretching in directions the sun could not explain. Horses refused to step deeper than a few paces, but they planted hooves and snorted, ears flicking toward sounds only they could hear, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing. In the villages, people moved through their days more slowly. Doors left ajar stayed open longer than custom allowed. Windows remained unshuttered even after dusk. Households that had once barred themselves against night now permitted the fog to drift inside, curling along floorboards, pooling in corners like patient water. Mothers did not scold children for leaving footprints in the thin film of moisture that gathered on stone floors. Instead, they watched the prints remain visible far longer than they should. Clear outlines of small feet that did not fade until the next dawn, as though time had decided to remember each step. The fog carried no voices, yet conversations felt interrupted. A woman speaking to her neighbour would pause mid-sentence, eyes searching the mist as though expecting the rest of her thought to arrive from elsewhere. The neighbour would wait without impatience, nodding slowly, as if she too had heard the missing words somewhere just beyond hearing. When speech resumed, it came softer, more deliberate, each phrase carrying an unspoken suffix, and yet something waits, acts. On Olympus the fog rose higher than it ever had before. It climbed the marble steps, slid between columns, gathered in the open courts where gods once raced and feasted. The eternal flame in the great hall burned unchanged, yet its light diffused through the mist until the hall seemed larger, emptier. Zeus walked its length at midnight, robe trailing behind him like a wake. He passed empty thrones, each one draped now in faint silver vapour. He did not sit. He continued walking until he reached the westernmost terrace, where the fog pressed thickest against the balustrade, threatening to spill over the edge into the world below. He stopped, lifted one hand. The mist parted around his fingers without resistance, then closed again the moment he withdrew them. For a long moment he stood motionless, palms still raised, as though testing the thickness of absence itself. Hera appeared beside him without sound. She wore no crown, no golden diadem, only a simple linen robe the colour of first light. She did not speak at first. Together they watched the fog roll across the plain far below, swallowing rivers, blotting fields, leaving only the dark shapes of mountains like teeth against the obscured sky. It no longer asks permission to enter, she said at last, voice low, almost conversational. Zeus did not answer immediately. When he did, the words came without thunder. It never needed to. They stood in silence after that, side by side. Two statues carved from the same reluctant stone. Neither moved to dispel the mist. Neither summoned wind or light. They simply allowed it to settle, to thicken, to claim the spaces between them. Elsewhere on the mountain, Poseidon descended the long stair to the sea, cave where the spring of Oceanus once bubbled clear. The water no longer rose. It lay flat, mirror, dark, reflecting nothing. He knelt at the edge and trailed his fingers across the surface. No ripple answered. The water accepted the touch without disturbance, without memory. He withdrew his hand and stared at the unmarked surface for a long time. Then he rose, turned, and climbed back up the stair without once looking behind him. Athena had ceased drawing lines. She sat now in the centre of her chamber floor, surrounded by blank scrolls arranged in a perfect circle. In the middle of the circle lay a single unstrung bow, the one she had carried into battle since the day she sprang armed from her father's brow. She had not touched it in weeks. Instead, she watched the fog drift across the marble, pooling around the bow's limbs, outlining them in faint silver. The weapon looked smaller than she remembered, almost fragile. She reached out once, fingertips hovering above the string that was not there, then withdrew again. The fog thickened around her hand, gentle, insistent, as though urging her to finish the gesture she had begun lifetimes ago. Apollo remained on the temple steps each dawn, lyre untouched beside him. The fog arrived earlier every morning, cloaking the sunrise until only a diffuse glow marked its passage. He no longer lifted his face to the light. He simply sat, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, watching the mist move across the marble in slow, deliberate currents. Sometimes he whispered single words into the vapour, not names, not prayers, only fragments, but edgy interval, crossing. The fog accepted each syllable without echo, without judgment. Hermes walked farther each day. He no longer kept to the paths of Olympus or the roads of mortals. He moved through borderlands, places where forest met plain, where river met sea, where day met night, without clean division. The fog followed him, or perhaps preceded him. He could no longer tell. In one such place, a narrow pass between two cliffs, he stopped. The mist had gathered so densely that visibility ended at arm's length. He extended one hand, palm forward. But a vapour parted around it, then closed again, but not before he felt something brush his skin. Not wind, not cold, but recognition. He did not flinch. He simply stood there, hand still outstretched, letting the mist remember him in return. In the mortal world, the strangeness deepened into ceremony. In a highland village, the oldest woman gathered the children at dusk and led them to the edge of the fog. She carried no torch. She needed none. She stopped where the mist began and knelt. The children followed. One by one they laid their palms against the vapour, as though greeting an elder. The fog did not retreat. It simply flowed around their small hands, curling between fingers, tracing the lines of palms that had not yet known labour. When the last child had touched it, the old woman spoke a single phrase, in a tongue no longer taught. We remember the shape of the door even when the door is gone. Say, she rose. The children rose. They walked back down the slope in silence, footprints filling slowly behind them with silver mist. At sea, captains no longer relied on stars. The constellations had drifted too far, their patterns softened by fog that rose even from the water. Instead they listened. When the sails went slack and the oars dipped without rhythm, they waited. Eventually a current would arrive, not strong, not fast, but steady. They followed it without question. It carried them to harbours they had never seen charted, where lanterns burned in windows that should have faced only cliff. No one greeted them on the docks. No one needed to. The ships tied up, the crews stepped ashore, and walked inland until they reached thresholds they recognized without knowing why. Night by night the fog climbed higher. It reached the lower slopes of Olympus now, brushing the feet of ancient statues, pooling in the cracks between marble blocks. The mountain itself seemed to breathe more slowly, each inhalation drawing the mist deeper into stone. In the deepest recess of the great hall, where the eternal flame still burned, a single drop of condensation gathered on the ceiling far above. It hung for a long moment, trembling, then fell. It struck the marble floor without sound. The flame did not flicker, but the light it cast changed, subtly, irrevocably. A new shadow appeared on the wall behind the throne. Not the shadow of Zeus, not the shadow of any god still named. A silhouette without features, without outline, yet unmistakably present. The shape left when a god is removed from the place he once occupied. The fog thickened around it, almost protectively, and somewhere in the spaces between heartbeat and silence, a pressure increased. Not angry, not vengeful, only patient, only inevitable. The listener felt the room grow quieter, the air heavier, as though the story itself had paused to listen for the next slow footfall of something returning home. The 6th month arrived as a hush so complete it felt like the world had paused between one breath and the next. Rivers no longer moved forward. They simply held still, surfaces polished to mirror, black, reflecting every cloud, every overhanging branch, every passing bird with such fidelity that the reflection seemed more real than the thing itself. Fish hovered motionless beneath the skin of the water, fins fanned, eyes open, as though waiting for permission to remember how to swim. Fishermen lowered their lines and let them drift without pull. Hooks sank straight down and stayed there, untouched. When the men finally drew them up, the bait remained pristine, as though nothing living had passed that way in centuries. In the olive groves, frost no longer rimmed the leaves. Instead, the leaves themselves began to turn translucent, thin as parchment held to lamplight. Sun passed through them without scattering. It simply continued onward, casting leaf, shaped pools of gold on the ground below, pools that did not shift as the day progressed. Harvesters moved among the trees more slowly than ever, baskets empty at their sides. They reached up, touched a single fruit, then withdrew their hands without picking it. The olives hung, heavy, ripe, yet unwilling to fall. The trees stood in patient vigil, silvered now not by frost, but by their own increasing fragility. Villages emptied of sound at midday. No dogs barked. No children ran shouting through narrow streets. Mothers sat at looms and let the shuttle rest idle in their laps. Fathers leaned against door frames and watched the fog that still lingered in the low places, no longer climbing, simply waiting. When conversation began again, it came in fragments, single words offered like stones laid on an altar. Door, step name. No one answered. No one needed to. The words hung between speakers until the next speaker added another, building something word by word, without hurry, without conclusion. On Olympus the fog had thickened into something closer to water than air. It pooled in the courtyards, rose slowly up the columns, lapped at the bases of thrones. The gods no longer walked through it, they waded. Zeus stood knee, deep on the western terrace, robe heavy, clinging. He lifted one foot, set it down again. The mist parted reluctantly, then closed behind him. He looked out over the world and saw only silver, endless, unbroken, swallowing horizon and sky alike. Hera appeared at his side, barefoot, linen soaked to transparency. She reached down, scooped a handful of fog, let it run between her fingers. It did not fall. It simply drifted upward again, rejoining the mass. She watched it rise without expression. "We are becoming the boundary we removed," she said. Zeus turned his head slowly. For the first time his eyes held no storm. Then let it finish. They stood together as the fog climbed higher, brushing their waists, their chests, their shoulders. Neither moved to retreat. Neither summoned wind or flame. They allowed the silver to rise until it touched their chins, until it pressed gently against their lips. Far below, in the still heart of a forgotten cave, the single drop that had fallen moons earlier now hung suspended midway between ceiling and pool, neither falling nor rising, simply present. Around it the darkness had acquired shape tall, quiet, patient, not flesh, not shadow, only outline, only the space once occupied. The pressure increased once more, not as force, but as recognition. And in that recognition the fog across the world gave a single, slow pulse. Like a heartbeat remembered after long silence. The 7th month arrived as the moment when silence decides to speak. The fog no longer crept. It stood. Across every plain, every valley, every shore, it rose in motionless columns taller than cypress, wider than city walls, silver and absolute. Villages lay within its embrace like relics preserved in crystal. Houses remained intact, roofs untouched by rain or wind. Inside, fires burned in hearths without consuming wood. Flames danced in perfect, unchanging loops. Families sat at tables, spoons poised above bowls that never emptied nor cooled. No one moved. No one needed to. Time had not stopped. It had simply grown courteous enough to wait. In the olive groves the translucent leaves no longer let light pass through. They became the light. Each leaf glowed softly from within, casting no shadow, holding a steady radiance that made the groves look like chambers of pale flame. The olives, still hanging, had turned the colour of moonstone. When the faintest breeze, more memory than movement, brushed them, They chimed once. A single clear note that travelled outward without fading, absorbed by the standing fog. Rivers held their mirrored surfaces like shields. Nothing broke them. Not stone, not leaf, not the slow fall of a heron's feather. Beneath the skin the fish remained suspended, gills barely stirring, as though the act of breathing had become an afterthought. Along the banks reeds stood rigid, tips touching tips across the water, forming arches no one would ever pass beneath. On Olympus the silver had reached the throats of the gods. Zeus stood chest, deep now, arms at his sides, eyes open. The mist pressed against his skin without weight, without temperature. It simply occupied the space where motion once lived. He looked toward Hera. She looked back. Neither blinked. Between them the fog thickened until their forms blurred at the edges, blending into the same luminous grey. Poseidon remained in his sea, cave, water lapping at his waist. The mirror, dark pool had risen to meet him. He held his trident loosely. The prongs rested against the stone floor without force. He gazed into the reflection and saw not his own face, but the outline of something taller, quieter, standing just behind his shoulder. He did not turn. There was no need. Athena sat cross, legged in the centre of her circle of scrolls. The unstrung bow lay across her knees. The fog had covered her to the collarbone. She lifted one hand slowly, as though moving through honey, and placed her palm flat against the place where her heart would beat if hearts still counted time. She felt nothing. Then she felt everything, the faint, patient pressure of a name pressing back from the other side of absence. Apollo remained on the temple steps. The lyre had vanished beneath the silver. Only his face remained visible above the tide. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the glow from the groves far below reflected in his irises, but not as borrowed light, but as recognition. Hermes stood at the narrow pass where he had first felt the touch. The cliffs on either side had disappeared into fog. He extended both arms now, palms forward. The mist flowed between his fingers, around his wrists, up his forearms. It did not bind him. It simply remembered him. He smiled once, small, tired, relieved. In the cave the suspended drop trembled once, then it fell, not fast, not slow, only inevitable. When it struck the pool the sound was not splash, but sigh. The fog across the world gave one final, slow pulse, and held. The listener understood then the end was not coming. It was already here, patient, complete, waiting only for permission to be named again. The 8th month was not a month at all. It was the instant when everything that had been held apart finally touched. The standing columns of fog dissolved. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way ink returns to water. After long separation, slowly, completely, without remainder. Silver bled back into air until the world reappeared unchanged yet utterly altered. Rivers remembered motion. One ripple broke the mirror surface, then another. Then the current flowed forward again, as though it had never paused. Fish darted once more, swift and silver, carrying no memory of stillness. Leaves on the olive trees lost their translucence and returned to green, heavy with ordinary dew. The olives fell at last, not in waste, but in gentle release, rolling across the grass to rest where they belonged. Villages stirred, Spoons dipped into bowls and found the food warm, finite real. Mothers finished lullabies that had waited mid-phrase. Fathers stepped from doorways into sunlight that carried no extra weight. Children ran through streets shouting. Footprints ordinary now, fading with each step. At crossroads the pebble patterns remained, but no one avoided them anymore. They simply walked across, stepping through the remembered doorways without ceremony, without fear. In the groves the single chime of moonstone olives echoed one final time, then faded into wind and birdsong. Harvesters lifted their baskets and began to gather, hands steady, voices rising in quiet conversation. The earth accepted the harvest without reluctance. The sky arched clear above them. Stars fixed once more in their ancient courses. The drifting constellation returned to its kneeling shape, guardian once again.